Galway, a small patch of land has been walled off. A patch of land with an awful secret. 6 years ago, local historian Catherine Corliss realised that under the grass, in and around an old septic tank, lay the bodies of hundreds of babies and infants.
They didn't have coffins, they were wrapped in shrouds, and they were just left in a disused sewage tank.
That sewage tank was in the grounds of a mother and baby home run by Catholic nuns known as the Bon Secours Sisters for women and girls who'd fallen pregnant outside of marriage. Under pressure from widespread international concern, in 2015, the Irish government set up an official commission of investigation into Ireland's mother and baby homes. Well, this is the commission building, even though there's no sign. Doesn't look much really, but for the survivors, it represents all their hopes and their fears and their suspicions. Nearly 800 babies died in Tuam. But that is just part of this story. The Commission is investigating 14 of the Republic's mother and baby homes, of which 10 were run by Catholic orders. In these films, we investigate evidence that between 4,000 and 6,000 babies and infants died in their care.
The nuns knew babies were dying, and they did nothing about it. It's neglecting babies to death.
And we reveal how what began as a church and state-sponsored moral crusade became a conveyor belt of institutional abuse.
I was deprived of a mother, and then they tried to deprive my children, my son, of a mother.
This is a scandal which has destroyed families, cost thousands of lives, and raised profound questions about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Irish state.
When the British left, we got a substitute oppressor, which was the church. But the church did not do it alone. The church was aided and abetted by the state.
It all began so differently. In 1916, Ireland's heroic but doomed Easter Rising was brutally crushed by the British. But it left a hugely symbolic legacy, a proclamation which guaranteed universal suffrage and equal rights to all its citizens.
The proclamation of Irish independence was actually quite a beautiful document that begins all Irish men and Irish women. And our equality is established from the very beginning.
But for the victims of Ireland's mother and baby homes, that promise of justice and equality was to be cruelly betrayed.
The people who took control of the mechanics of government. They were arch-conservative. They were hand in glove with the Catholic Church.
Two men came to epitomise that relationship. Prime Minister Eamon de Valera, regarded by many as the father of the modern Republic of Ireland, and Archbishop John Charles Macrae.
Macrae worked very closely. You could almost say that de Valera, who was the Prime Minister, worked for Macrae.
The position of the Catholic Church as the arbiter of all that was ethical, correct, and moral in Irish society became beyond challenge. They wished to portray this island as a shining light of Catholicism.
But with no sex education allowed in schools, and contraception and abortion banned by church and state, pregnancies outside marriage were perhaps inevitable. And the solution to that was mother and baby homes.
The whole point of these institutions was to hide and contain any sexual immorality from a Catholic. Men who committed crimes against women and children weren't locked up because they weren't evidence. But the pregnant woman was evidence. The illegitimate child was evidence that people had had sex outside of marriage.
From 1922, new mother and baby homes sprung up across the country, presented to young women as a solution to their shameful sin. There were actually no such thing.
The Irish state and the Catholic Church created the most appalling misogynist state. And they did so through the architecture of containment.
That architecture of containment incorporated Ireland's notorious Magdalen laundries, where hundreds of so-called fallen women were subjected to brutal regimes of forced labour. It included the country's network of bleak industrial schools, part orphanages, part penal institutions, run by orders of nuns and brothers. And the final element, the mother and baby homes. In the near 7 decades of their existence, more than 30,000 women would pass through their doors. Maggie O'Connor was sent to Tuam in 1937, though for most of her life she kept it secret from her daughter, Annette.
As a child, any discussion about the nuns meant Mum was in trouble. And it would be just complete trauma and stress and upset. I couldn't understand who these nuns were and what they'd done to her. As I got older then, she started to talk to me and she started to tell me about the nuns.
Maggie was just 13 when her mother, Annette's grandmother, died, leaving her to look after 7 younger brothers and sisters. Unable to cope, the children were taken away, not into care, but to court.
Mum was charged, because that's what it says, with what charged, found destitute, and sentenced to 2.5 years in Lennaboy Castle in Galway that was run by the Sisters of Mercy.
Lennaboy Castle was a particularly cruel industrial school. An inspector at the time described the children there as
emaciated, cowed, dirty and unhappy,
and said their diet had been
reduced almost to starvation level.
Maggie's life in Lennaboy was filled with suffering. When she was 17, it got worse.
She was raped by the caretaker. And she didn't tell anybody about that rape until she was 70. She was so adamant it was rape. He raped me. And she was taken. She was taken to mother and baby home because she was pregnant outside marriage.
Maggie was moving to the next stage on the church's conveyor belt of abuse. Anna Corrigan's mother, Bridget Dolan, was also sent to Tuam, though she never told her daughter.
My mother died in 2001. And in 2012, then, I decided to do some family research. They both came as damaged people. My mother from the mother and baby homes, and my father from the industrial schools.
When her father, William, was just 7, his mother had died of tuberculosis, with tragic consequences for William and his siblings.
The children were sentenced to 10 years in industrial schools. A crime bin, their mother died.
William's sister Molly ended up in St. Brigid's Industrial School for Girls, run by the Sisters of Mercy in Loughrea. Former inmates here have reported both physical and sexual abuse. When Molly was just 13, she became ill and died. There is a neat and orderly nuns' graveyard in front of the school. Molly's grave is unknown and unmarked.
Growing up, I didn't know anything about it. I knew nothing about my parents' life. They had to bury the secret. They had to bury this guilt. I'm still trying to process how she coped.
Ireland's architecture of containment targeted women it identified as sinful and the poor it saw as undeserving. But it stands charged with targeting another group for its ethnicity.
I'm a member of the travelling community. In my culture, the boogeyman, the cruelty man, as we call him, he was a child kidnapper. He took children away from their families, their parents.
One day in 1951, when Catherine Coffey O'Brien's mother was a small child, the cruelty man, officially a child protection officer, arrived at her family's camp and seized her and her 9 siblings.
These were children. They were all sentenced into various industrial schools.
Like so many travelling families before and since, the children were scattered in institutions across the country. Catherine's aunt died at 17 in Killarney.
We still don't know how she died.
2 of her uncles ended their days in St Finian's Mental Hospital. By the 1950s, Ireland had the highest proportion of people in mental hospitals in the world, more even than the USSR under Stalin.
My grandmother died in Carcevine, blind in abject poverty. And never seen, and even all but 2 of her children again. She didn't even know where her own daughter was buried.
Meanwhile, Catherine's traumatized mother married briefly and had Catherine. But with her mum in and out of mental institutions, Catherine was sent to a succession of industrial schools, where she experienced constant racist abuse and violence, often at the hands of nuns.
I was thrown into a bath of water and I was scrubbed within an inch of my life. Scrub the knacker for me was the term used. It's a very racist, horrible, negative term for a traveller.
Catherine did eventually escape industrial school, moved into a bedsit and fell in love. But her happiness was not to last.
Before that, I got pregnant. I found out that he had a fling with a young one, another girl. I went to social workers, and she said to me, "There's a place in Cork you can go to," she said.
Catherine was being sent to Bessborough Mother and Baby Home, run by the Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. She was going back to an institution.
All the industrial schools, all the orphanages, the Magdalens, and the mother and baby homes, they were all interconnected. And once your family was through the system, it was almost like you had a target in your back.
At least 900 babies and infants are known to have died in Bessborough, the last in 1994. But the burial places of only 64 are recorded. The sisters, whose convent still overlooks the grounds, claim to have no idea where they buried the other 800 or more.
Is just more deny until they die. I don't believe for 1 second they don't know where the burial grounds are.
The same order of nuns ran another home, Seanross Abbey in Rosscray, Tipperary. They sold the buildings in 2018.
It is actually the first time that any film crew have been allowed inside the actual Seanross Abbey house itself.
So when your mother, all the other mothers, were told... Teresa Collins was born here.
Every one of them was brought downstairs. As we say, out of sight, out of mind. Now, as far as we can gather, this was the delivery suite. The reason being down here is so quiet.
There would be no pain relief allowed and no pain relief available.
The pain of childbirth would be part of your sin and atonement. If you're in pain, tough.
You're nothing. You're dirt, right? Whispering in your ear when you're given a horrendous birth, a breech birth.
Well, it was a word or 2 minutes of pleasure. Your child is spawn of the devil.
In Castle Pollard, where over 220 babies are known to have died, survivors speak of the screaming room, an outhouse where mothers in labour were taken when their cries of agony got too loud.
So the baby would be born then. She would be allowed a few days rest with the baby, but then it was back to work. And from that point, she'd only be allowed to see the baby to breastfeed the baby. So it was just, to me, not to be crude, bringing in the cows for milking.
Mothers were usually compelled to stay in the home for a year or more, working unpaid to feed their child and in penance for their sin.
A woman has a baby out of wedlock, she commits a mortal sin. Can you imagine a mortal sin? A murderer, when they commit murder, in the eyes of the church, commits a mortal sin. You're on par with a murderer, damned to hell and hellfire.
And when their time of penance was up, they were cast out and made to leave their children behind.
When my mother actually left, it was in the middle of the biggest snowstorm we ever had in Ireland. I have this picture of her walking down the road with her suitcase, having to leave her baby behind.
Anna doesn't know if her mother was ever given news of John, the son she left behind. But we do have a description of him. It's from a government inspector who visited Tuam shortly afterwards.
A miserable, emaciated child with voracious appetite and no control over bodily functions. Probably mental defective.
Less than 2 months later, he was dead.
John was born normal and healthy. They starved him to death. There's no question about it. Emaciated, you're starving. Voracious appetite, you're not being fed.
The government inspector also noted that out of 66 babies born or admitted to the home in the previous 6 months, 21, nearly a third of them, had died. When Annette Mackay's mother Maggie gave birth to her daughter Mary Margaret in Tuam, it seems she tried to resist the nuns' rules.
Anybody who was cheeky or would disagree with the nuns or demand to see their child, they were the problem. So she was moved to Loughrea Industrial School.
There, in early June 1943, just 6 months after she'd given birth, a nun approached Maggie with some news about the daughter she'd left behind in Tuam.
She remembers so clearly the day, pegging out the washing. The nun came, told her the child of your sin is dead, and let her go the same day.
While poorer mothers paid penance in unpaid labour, richer girls could buy their way out for 4,000 or 5,000 euros in today's money. But even rich girls could not avoid the trauma of having their baby taken from them. The nuns soon saw another potential source of income there: adoptions.
The babies were just another commodity. That's all we were to the church.
They thought, right, this is a baby-making factory. I can make money out of this. That's where the greediness came in.
And so Shannon Airport, just 60 miles west of Shanross Abbey, found itself at the centre of an international trade in trafficked babies, mainly to the families of returning American servicemen.
The church realised that babies in Ireland could be sold to America as guaranteed white babies.
In order to put the babies up for adoption, the nuns would pressurise mothers into signing away their rights. And occasionally, it seems, they also resorted to forgery.
I was talking to one particular mother who couldn't actually sign her name. All she could do was put down an X. And when she went to look at her adoption for her daughter in the adoption files, the signature was signed her name, but not her signature. So we knew the falsified documents.
But if you wanted to adopt a child, there was one criteria you needed to satisfy above all.
The Catholic Church was afraid that Catholic babies would be adopted by Protestant couples and their souls would be lost to the Catholic Church.
The true figure of trafficked babies may never be known. To this day, hundreds of those children may have no idea they are adopted. But the most shocking consequence of that church and state system was the fate of those who didn't escape it or survive it. Between 4,000 and 6,000 babies died in Ireland's mother and baby homes from diseases that read like a litany of neglect.
Erasmus is malnutrition. Why does a baby, where these people are being paid money to look after them, die of malnutrition?
The nuns knew the babies were dying at mortality rates of 20, 30, 40% a year after year, and they did nothing about it.
I was 18 when I started here.
In the mid-80s, Michael Donovan was working as a gardener in the Sean Ross Abbey mother and baby home when he was asked by the nuns to help landscape an overgrown area of scrub.
It was just dirty weeds, rotten briars and stuff like that, so we were told to come down here and clean up. After then, drove down this way and turned over the sod, and I just noticed lots of small bones.
That area, where Michael found the bones, is now a carefully tended child burial ground known as an angel's plot. But that plot is not all it seems. 9 years ago, the nuns admitted that 269 babies had died in Sean Ross, a number that could plausibly be buried in this plot. But it is now clear that over 1,000 babies died here. So where are they? This photograph was taken in 1974, not long after the nuns closed their home. But there is no obvious sign of the Angels plot, which the nuns now claim was a consecrated graveyard where they buried babies in individual coffins. However, we've established that the area above this hedge, which takes up the top third of the nuns' claimed Angels plot, actually contains a pit used by the nuns for the mass burial of unbaptized babies and stillborns. Tony Maguire is an archaeologist and anthropologist who specializes in the location and excavation of unmarked graves.
There are no death certificates for these infants, and those infants are not included in your 1,000 plus babies for Sean Ross Abbey.
So, with that area unavailable for the 1,000 burials, it is even clearer the remaining area cannot be the true extent of the graveyard. The most probable scenario is that in reality, it extends either to a faintly visible pathway here on the 1974 picture, or right up to the walled garden here. And that is a cause of deep concern because of something else we have discovered. This plan, produced by Tipperary Town Council, was submitted to the Commission. A copy has found its way to us. It describes a sewage pipe installed in the late 90s, which runs from an inspection hatch here, directly beside the current Angels plot, to an inspection hatch here and beyond. But as we've established, that plan is wrong in several important respects. The inspection hatches are actually here and here. And between them, in a project apparently agreed between the nuns and the council, a sewage system has been constructed in land which may well contain child burials. In early 2019, the Commission ordered a ground-penetrating radar survey of the plot, followed by test excavations. They've still not said what they found, but we can reveal the survey confirmed the existence of a tank within the Angels' plot. Like Shanross Abbey, Bessborough Mother and Baby Home in Cork was run by the Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, whose convent still overlooks the home. The home closed in the late 90s, but that cannot erase its awful past. As this confidential health service briefing notes,
from 1934 to 1953, 1/4 of all babies died in their first 12 months of life.
over 900 babies died here, but only 64 graves are recorded, and families are desperate to know where the rest are buried.
The nuns used to point to the area at the front of the folly that we called the Angels' Plot. It was a little semicircular area. She'd bring a woman along and she'd go, there now. She'd tap the ground. There now, your baby's buried there.
And so this tiny plot became the focus for the grief of survivors and relatives.
This was what they called the Angels' Plot, the area that they said that the 900 babies are buried.
Just in that?
Yeah, but we know they're not buried in here.
The nuns now suggest they can't remember where they buried them. A claim described by the Commission as
very difficult to understand.
I don't believe for 1 second they don't know where the burial grounds are.
The Commission acknowledged that although children could be buried in the grounds, they had reviewed all the available maps, all available aerial images, and had conducted site surveys. But they could find
no physical or documentary evidence of possible unrecorded burial arrangements.
But the Commission missed a vital piece of evidence. This map. It is a hand-annotated plan prepared by an official cartographer during a site visit in 1949 that Maureen and her group found in the archives of the Irish Ordnance Survey. And it specifically describes an area along the side of a wooded path leading from the main house towards the folly as a children's burial ground. But could unmarked graves still be visible decades after they were dug?
A grave never settles. You've loosened the ground. It never fills back in exactly the way it was. You can see the impressions in the ground quite clearly. The grave is always identifiable.
We are in the relevant area now. We're standing on hallowed ground. And we're walking on the baby's grave, which is a cultural thing that we don't do in Ireland.
We sent the drone up to get a better view. We could see a couple of old vegetable beds, but something else as well. Smaller, rectangular patches. We took our images to Tony.
They are regular, they're in rows, they're of size. They would match what you would expect to find for an individual infant burial. Given that you have a potential for infant burial here, they're a definite area of interest, significantly of interest. To ignore prominent features like that is a big mistake.
In that small area alone, we can discern perhaps a couple of dozen potential graves. So this whole area is vitally important to the families and to the Commission. But it's also, of course, a potential crime scene, which makes what we see next all the more disturbing. Someone is digging up the area and working towards the suspected graves.
It's deeply concerning because no one should be digging around here without a forensic archaeologist on site. There's too much evidence to be lost. It's too dangerous. Are you worried about digging here?
There's no suggestion the workman has any idea of the significance of the site, but he agrees to stop work and we inform the centre management of the area's importance.
Just so you know, it's an area under question.
The Commission told us it was well aware of all the matters we mentioned and added that as it was conducting a statutory investigation, it does not comment on the evidence available to it. But this story is very far from over. The Church and the Irish state have a lot of questions to answer.
Well, the film ends with exactly the point that the Church and the state still have huge questions to answer. Joining us this evening is Anne O'Gorman, who was 17 when she gave birth to her baby daughter in Bessborough, one of the homes. Maureen Considine, who we saw in the film there, is a researcher and one of the co-founders of the Cork Survivors and Supporters Alliance, and Callum Macrae, who's an Emmy and Bafta-nominated filmmaker, who with reporter Laurence Lee made the two films that we brought together tonight for a slightly shorter screening, but do watch both of them if you can. And we were very much hoping to have either a representative of church or state, which would have been fantastic, but unfortunately they weren't available. Anne O'Gorman, you were at Bessborough. What do you remember about it?
I went there when I was 17. It was a social worker that brought me there. And I didn't even know where a baby came from. You know, how it was to be born. And I used to be put in the labour ward to help a few of the girls. So then I knew. But when my time came, I was in an awful lot of pain. No pain relief, nothing to ease the pain. You're just left there till your baby's ready to be born. When the baby was being born, about to be born, there was a nun present, and there was another girl. I don't know who the girl was. The girl used to aid, you know, like I did when babies was being born. But when the baby came, she took the baby and went over by the window with her back towards me and asked that girl to call for it was a retired nurse, Nurse Walsh, to call her. And when the nurse came, she twisted the afterbirth out of my stomach. And I could see them working on the baby, but I passed out. It was 3 days later I woke up, and a nun came to me, another nun, and she said, "You have an angel in heaven." And it was the following day then that I was bleeding very heavy. I was hemorrhaging, and I got up out of my bed and I went to the window because the nun asked me, did I want to see the baby? And I said no, because I was frightened. I'd never seen anyone dead. To get me, the fear was just terrible. And I regret that today, that I never looked at her. But then I seen two men when I looked out the window carrying an orange crate box or an onion box. It was a crate, a wooden box. And they went off down by the valley, you know, down that path. But in 1975, I was there again. And when I gave my name, they knew my name. And I said I had a baby here in 1972. And they said, you know, that they had a record of me being there, but they had no record of my baby being born there. So I ran away with my son. And they were all a mess.
I mean, it's hard to imagine being 17 on your own, in a sense, with no friends around, no family.
No family.
And going through that.
Well, I was the eldest of 10, and I couldn't tell my mother and father at the time. And I had no one to turn to. And I knew about, I think it was Cura or something. It was a place that you go to, and the social worker brought me there. And I was frightened, but the nuns, when I went there, because I wasn't the brightest, they gave me a hard time, you know, as within scrubbing, cleaning, everything. And like I said, I ran away with my son, and I just got on in life. And it was, I think it was 2012. I went to my local shop and I seen the newspaper, and I seen the headlines, you know, the front of the paper, and I was in the house of my own home, and I opened up the newspaper, and it was like someone got a key and just opened up everything. And ever since, I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken. All the things I could have done, and crying for help, that nobody wanted to listen to me. And but one night we were watching telly, my mother and I, before she died, well, years before she died, and she said to me, we were watching the Magdalene sisters, and I said to her, I said, Ma'am, I was in a place like that. And she said, where you went? Yeah, I said, I lost a baby. My baby died. And my mother said to me, she said, and if I had known, no, she had 10 children herself, she said, I would have helped you. But she said...
So sorry to cut across. When you say you read the headlines and it sort of was like a key turning and it unlocked everything for you, what were those headlines saying that spoke to what had happened to you?
It wasn't what happened to me, it was what happened to hundreds of women. I think that was now before June came out. It was a whistleblower that blew the lead in them, and saying about the secrets, the dirty secrets that we had to keep and things like that. And it just opened up everything, and it made me aware of everything. Because when you're rearing a family, you kind of push everything. You know, I was ashamed, I was everything. So you just push it aside. And it's hard and it's still tough, you know. Loads of regrets, everything.
Do you look now, though, and see that you were a young woman who was a victim?
I do.
Of the most incredible cruelty?
I do. It was my friends, Catherine Coffey O'Brien and Maureen, that's there with you. They showed me how to speak, and they taught me none of it was my fault.
And I'll come back to you in a second.
Yeah.
That's all right. Maureen, I mean, the story that Anne tells, as I say, it is the most unbelievable cruelty on so many levels, isn't it? And this was played out exactly as Anne says, against hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women. Sorry, Maureen, you may still be on mute.
Your volume may be low or not. You're not on mute.
Maureen, while you sort that out, I'm hoping you can still hear us at least. Callum, I mean, some elements of the story that you tell in those two films was obviously had obviously already come out, and you found new aspects, new horrors, if you like, of the continued cruelty. As a journalist, when you're looking at this story, what did you find that surprised you?
Well, the whole story surprised me. I mean, the thing is that when we started making this film, obviously we knew the bare bones of the story, but just the sheer horror of what happened just was absolutely breathtaking all the way through. And I mean, I still, you know, find it very hard to believe what happened. I still find it very hard to listen to Anne, for example. I think that the thing that was most shocking, in a way, or most surprising, was just the sheer level of state and church involvement in this. And as an outsider, actually looking at what happened in Ireland, you know, and actually as a Brit looking at what happened in Ireland, the very progressive, as Maureen pointed out in the film, the very progressive, forward-thinking, egalitarian sentiments of the proclamation were so stunningly betrayed by this awful conspiracy between, you know, the state, most notably de Valera, and the church, in sort of corrupting the hopes and aspirations of Irish independence into the creation of really a misogynist state, which was so determined to prove that Ireland was this pure country, and I think Maureen spoke very eloquently about it in the film. This country of purity. That they had to conceal and hide all the awful things that were happening, and of course, an awful lot of those awful things were happening were caused by the church and the state, by their rules, by their repression.
And ironically, the misogyny meted out mainly by women in the homes themselves, by the nuns.
I absolutely. I mean, one of the most astonishing phenomenons was, I mean, clearly the church was a very patriarchal organization, and there was a patriarchy at the top of it all. But actually, that it was so all-consuming that really the nuns were misogynist, and they almost hated themselves.
Maureen, I hope you can hear us okay, and I hope, more to the point, we can hear you. I mean, it is often talked about as this stain on Ireland's history, almost sounding almost an aberration, if you like, a one-off tragedy, but thousands and thousands of babies, as we know, in these homes, women's lives destroyed over decades and decades, with no intervention, it would seem, from church or state, who both organisations knew what was going on.
Oh, no.
Maureen, we still can't hear you, I don't think. Are there any buttons you could press as a desperate attempt? I'm desperate to hear what you've got to say. Maureen, I'm going to leave you just for a moment to see. We're still not able to hear you for some reason. We'll try both ends, as it were. Anne, I suppose it's naive, isn't it, perhaps, to think that nuns of all people within the church might show compassion, might show care. And what the film shows is that there was sort of state-sponsored, church-backed neglect of babies and complete disregard for women.
Yeah, most definitely. The nuns, they didn't care, and they worked with the social workers, and it was just, they were just joined together, the priests, the nuns. Now, I believe in God, and I believe in all the saints, but I cannot go to church again. No, I seen what my mother suffered. She gave her last penny to the church, and my mother thought that they were very good and everything, and she nearly died. But, you know, when I told her about how cruelly
How difficult was that for you? You believe in God, but everything that happens to you in the name of God is nothing the most awful cruelty, a sort of violence in terms of what it does to your mental health. How does that feel that you can't go to church now, that in a sense your has been more than tested?
You feel at a loss. You really feel the loss, you know, in what you were brought up to believe in, you know, to go to church, and that the priest was everything, the nuns was great, and it was the Sacred Heart nuns again that taught me in school, and they were cruel there as well, you know. And it's now in my older age that I see the cruelty that they have caused to loads of women and children, you know, across Ireland. It's just heartbreaking.
And
sorry, so I was just going to say very briefly, I mean, I think sort of relevant on given what Anne's saying is that although none of the orders took part in the films, although they were invited to, we did get a statement from the Sisters of the Sacred Heart. And their statement was this: we provided a service for these women. We did not create the society, excuse me, which contributed to such exclusion and pain. And I find that particularly shameless, because actually the church and the state did create that society. They did cause that exclusion and pain. And to somehow claim now it wasn't our fault, it was society's fault, blaming it on the people, and even indeed by implication on the women who suffered so much, just strikes me as appalling and inexcusable.
Well, I think they're very shameless altogether, because I see my baby going out in a box and they're denying. Now, for years, I was traumatized, because when it all came out, they were saying about the babies being adopted to America and everything. And not in the home now I was in, but there was some homes, they had frozen babies in freezers, and that showed the mother the dead baby wouldn't be her baby, but they would have adopted out her baby to America for a good few years, about 6, 7 years. I was in an awful way. But till I got my death cert, my birth cert and my death cert, it was Catherine Coffey O'Brien that got it for me. And I knew then that I was right, that what I seen going out in the box was my baby, you know. And that's why I said I'm not going to stand down from it. But I actually went to their new convent, and I was asking them questions, and they closed the door out my face. You know, how much more hurt have we to take?
Maureen, are you able to hear us and speak yet? Can we hear you? Let's just do one quick test. No, we're not hearing you yet, Maureen, I'm afraid. And sorry to interrupt you there. I just
all right.
Whether Maureen could hear us. I mean, how have you coped over the years with all of that until the point at which you got the death certificate, which in a sense proved what you had known for such a long time?
The way it was that I always worked day and night, and I reared 4 beautiful children myself. That's including now the son I ran away with. And, you know, when you're working, it blocks out the mind. And when you're rearing children, it blocks out the mind. But then when you get older, then everything comes back to you. You have time to think, sit down and think about it. And the pain is always there. It's like when you get a cut, you can put a plaster on it, but you can't put a plaster on a broken heart. You know, and there's no money that will heal that. There's no money whatsoever. I feel very left out.
Callum, you spoke there interestingly about the sort of response that you'd got from one of the Order of Nuns. The government's own commission was set up in 2015, as it said in the piece, and it finally reported a couple of months ago at the beginning of the year. And I thought it sort of adopts a similar tone in the early, from the get-go, which I found surprising, I have to say. You know, there's a sort of strange attempt to sort of give context to what was happening, saying that Ireland was a cold, harsh environment anyway for everyone, let alone the women in these homes, and responsibility for the harsh treatment of mothers of illegitimate babies rests mainly with the fathers. It must be acknowledged that the institutions under investigation provided a refuge, a harsh refuge, it concedes, but families provided no refuge at all. I mean, I have to say, I thought tonally that suggestion from the Commission's report was slightly strange to me, given how much the women had suffered and how big a role church and state had played in that.
I know. I mean, can you hear me? Yes. I mean, I think that there is this. It was very depressing. I think that was the conclusion, and this constant attempt to try and blame Irish society for what happened, rather than actually blaming the institutions that so profoundly affected and molded and modelled, and if you like, hijacked that society, which you know had actually fought for its independence to escape from that kind of, as I think Anna Corrigan said, when the British left, we got a substitute of pressure, the church aided by the state. And that process is still continuing. I mean, what's happening with the fact is that actually the mother and baby homes were just part of this conveyor belt. They were part of a conveyor belt involving the industrial schools, involving the Magdalen laundries. It was a systematic process of oppression instituted by the state. And the state and the church are so far still absolutely failing to take responsibility, are still effectively blaming it on Irish people who were the victims, and particularly these women. Who were the
Maureen, I wonder what your assessment of that is.
Yeah, you can hear me fine now, I hope.
Yes.
I'm on my phone.
Hooray.
Fantastic.
Am I here? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know, for us and for those of us who are working class and people like Anne and the travelling community here in Ireland, whose society is a big question, because we were considered, we are and were considered deviants of society. So who is society? And if society is the people who make the rules and people who make the laws, then yes, I agree with the Taoiseach, all of society was responsible. But if society includes the powerless and those who are acted upon, then it isn't a fair statement. But I will say the Commission's report acknowledged the misogyny, and nobody has ever acknowledged the misogyny before. Nobody has ever in officialdom said that this was a country that was absolutely rank with misogyny. And that was a big deal. It was a big deal even to get them to say it, you know. As far as our theocracy goes, I do think we live in a theocracy, in a society that is governed largely by the church, even now.
Even now?
Yeah. Repealing the Eighth was an absolute nightmare. Repealing the Eighth Amendment was a nightmare for the women of Ireland. They all had to tell their very intimate stories of pregnancy loss, and we had to go right outside of people's traditional view of abortion and let them know that the Eighth Amendment affected all women and all girls in such profound ways. Like, it affects you. If Savita died from a much wanted pregnancy, miscarrying a much wanted pregnancy. So I do think we still live in a theocracy. Our school systems are run largely by the church, so that when women like Anne are seeing their grandchildren getting christened, communion, confirmation, the church are very heavily involved in her grandchildren's life, because all of those sacraments come through the school system. You can't even enroll in a school in Ireland if you're not baptized. In the majority of cases, you cannot enroll unless you're baptized.
Just in terms of the specifics of the commission and how successful, in your view, that has been, Maureen, in answering the questions of the many women, the survivors, the surviving children. I mean, it took 5 long years. Has it delivered enough?
No. In a way, it suffers from being too big an inquiry that tried to do too many things, tried to speak to too many different interest groups and voices. The report, you could pick up the report and find mention of underage victims of rape, and in the same breath you could pick up the report and also find that the report is declaring that the women were there by consent. You know, the report is highly contradictory throughout. It's way too long, and that's part of the problem. The executive summary attempts to summarize 70 years of experiences across 14 different institutions, across different social classes of people and different experiences. So you could have public patients. Public patients were patients or women who were sent there, but they were being paid for by the public purse, as in the nuns got a rate for every woman and baby in there on the public purse. But there were also private patients, and the private patients were sent there generally by their families, and their families would generally pay around €200, depending on the time period, to buy them back out of the institution. So a lot, this is the one scandal in Ireland with institutions that affects women of every class, but it affects them in different ways. The other institutions were exclusively the underclass, but any woman can get pregnant, as we all know.
There are questions coming in which I'd like to turn to, if possible. I mean, Annette Macrae is asking, Callum, what did you think of the Commission report?
Well, I've kind of outlined already, and I think that Maureen explained it extremely well. I think it was extremely disappointing, and failed to confront that central responsibility of the church and the state, and that was just enormously disappointing.
And Stephen Jones has asked the question, you know, is the aim to try and get convictions? You know, should this now be a criminal inquiry?
Of course it should. Most definitely it should be. And the nuns are not being asked anything. They're not answering to anything. You know, they're saying that they can't remember where the babies are buried. Definitely.
When you heard that, Anne, that the nuns are saying, because even the Commission described it, I thought rather politely, as very difficult to understand or to accept. When you heard, Anne, the nuns saying, I'm afraid we don't remember where we buried these children, what did that do to you? What did you feel about that?
It made me come out with my story stronger. You know, before I couldn't speak, but now I want to tell the whole world what happened and what they done to us. Just poor mothers that can't speak. You know, that the married probably never told their children. You know, they can't come up with it today. I want them to know what they did do to us and what they're doing with our babies. It's cruel.
For those women who still hold the secret today, do you think, Anne?
Yeah, there has babies buried in Bessborough. I'm not talking about adoptions, I'm talking about babies that they had put into the ground. I have a friend, well, I met her down in when I had my son, and she's seen a baby being buried down there. So yeah, I want the whole world to know that they're nothing but liars, and they know damn well where they are.
Maureen, Maria Stapleton asks if we could respond or do anything in response both to Anne's story and the film. What should it be?
Well, we just came off a full day of an oral hearing with the planning authority here in Ireland, because there's an attempt to build a series of apartment blocks on the children's burial ground where Anne's baby and other babies are buried. And I suppose it's try not to be naive. If people want to help, try not to be naive, because all I've heard about that for the last couple of months is surely they won't build on a children's burial ground. They will. They can and they will. And if nobody stops them, they'll absolutely do that. So we need, when activists and campaigners and particularly mothers and survivors are speaking their truth, we really need people to sit up and listen and not treat us like we're hyperbolic or over the top. Because this is real, this is really happening. That burial ground is, today I watched a top legal mind in the country hammer away at one of our civil servants who had the courage to come forward with a map. And he hammered away at him for hours and there was nothing to stop him do it. And it made me understand why we don't have more support from the civil service who do have this information. They're afraid.
And so Helen Sharkey has said, you know, surely there is some way of seizing the land, establishing a cordon. Is there nothing that the state could do to intervene, or do you think that is what needs to happen?
We would like the state to buy the land by compulsory purchase order, and we argue that there's no reason why they cannot, because they do it when they're building roads. They buy, it's called a CPO, a compulsory purchase order, so they buy a piece of land off a farmer to build a road, and he might be very reluctant to sell, but they just take it off him. So they can do that with the land that is part owned by the nuns and part owned by a developer, and give these women some peace. And there's nothing to stop them doing that. If they can't do it, who can? Put it that way, you know.
And Anne, is your worry, or are you worried that the Commission report is out, you know, a big piece of work? I mean, as Maureen says, perhaps one of the problems is it's too long. But is your worry that people will forget if you don't keep speaking out?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and as well as that, we don't want history to repeat itself for our children and our grandchildren and all the little girls that has to grow up and everything. We don't want them to fall into that, you know, to be treated like that again. We want schools everywhere, colleges to know of our hurt and our pain, so as they won't have to go through it again. And
if I could just very briefly come in there, Jackie, I mean, it does seem to me that what Anne's saying there, it's not a question of not wanting, a lot of them are going through, and it's not, I mean, okay, the homes are closed, but the damage, the generational damage caused by this, the damaged, injured, you know, emotionally and psychologically injured people who went through this process and then have children and are finding it very difficult to bring up their own children. There is an ongoing generational damage. This crime, the consequences of this crime continue to this day. That's the other problem, is this effectively consigning it to history. You can't consign this to history. People are still suffering.
And Maureen, on that point, I mean, the government made it clear after the Commission report was published that we are humbly listening to voices which were ignored or silenced for many years. From the survivors that you speak to and deal with all the time, I mean, do you get a sense that they're being humbly listened to by government?
It's pretty rare. There are a few who I think are worth talking to, but it is a political football, and as much as all of the main parties pretend that they have more dignity than to treat it like a political football, that's what I've experienced. There are certain parties that I can't get on the phone because we will have we'll have minute differences of opinion, and because it doesn't suit the agenda that they're currently hammering, I can't get them on the phone, and that's opposition and government parties. I found the only way to have any hope is to kind of see what a person is like as an individual, and just try and hone in on any empathy they might have at all, and exploit it to the fullest extent I can possibly exploit it to. So if you have someone with a connection to infant death or something like that, you have a chance.
And just very briefly, we talked a little bit about government, but overall, what has been the response from the church? I mean, Anne, has anyone from the church, from the sisters to anybody from the church really, ever spoken to you directly? Have you ever had a direct apology?
No. My grandson and my granddaughter were making their confirmation, and we had to go to school. Well, the parents had to go to school, but I took over because they were working. So I went down, and we were sitting in a group around the table, and he was giving a speech, and he said, how come, he said, that the church is fallen, that there's no one going to mass or anymore. And I had my keys in my hand, and I was throwing them on the table, thinking, now I was only starting to speak out then, and I said, I do have a question for you. And he said, why is it? And I said to him, I said, I said, dead babies, I said, dead babies, you done wrong. And that's why the people are turning their backs on the churches. I said, and his face went red. He couldn't even answer it. And he said, we're not all like that. But I said, who isn't like that? I said, I can't trust anyway, which I can't, I can't. And as well as that, I went to the guards in Cork, and I asked them, about my daughter being there and everything. And like I said to them, I said, if it's drug dealers, I said, you can go in and confiscate everything off them, and you can't do it with the nuns that has our babies down there in the grounds.
It's a really difficult question, not an easy one to sort of answer, I suppose, briefly, but what, if anything, would give you peace after everything you've been through?
To know that my baby and all the babies and the mothers that's buried down there, for them to be left alone, to be left in the ground where they are for years, nearly half a century, my babies, and to mark and protect it and let it be a graveyard, with a fence around it, so it's no animals or anything can get on the farm, on the fields, on the graveyard, and for all the babies to be named.
Because you named your baby, didn't you?
I named my baby Evelyn O'Gorman. And my daughter is just after having a little girl, a granddaughter that's living with me. She's only 3 weeks old, and she even said it to me. She said, "Ma'am, I'm thinking you're thinking about Evelyn," and I was. Do you know what I mean? And that is so unfair, But that's all I want. Money, as I said, money can't buy your bit of peace. Money can't, for the damage they've done to me, it can't buy it.
Maureen, just very briefly, we're coming towards the end of this now. I mean, how optimistic are you that Anne and so many others will get justice that they truly deserve, and to be able to know that where their baby lies, to be able to show respect in the way that she asks. I mean, how optimistic are you?
I'm very optimistic, because otherwise I'd have to lay down and give up. It's all we have. Like, we do gather people around us as much as we can who are good people, and we try and make these connections. And you know, anyone who speaks out, particularly survivors and professionals in the civil service, we thank them for their courage. You know, we try and take them under our wing. You know, Anne had a tough day today because the oral hearing was on, but so did the civil servant who was standing up for women like Anne with the map evidence he had. He got absolutely hammered, and I will call him tomorrow and I will tell him he was a hero, because he needs that. And yeah, I'm filled with hope, and we'll get that burial ground marked. We will. I can't promise any kind of justice in a big way. Don't have a time machine. I can't go back and stop those things happening in the first place. And we, you know, dismantling patriarchy is such a huge task. I can't, you know, can't even think about it, but we can think about what interventions we can make in our local area, and how we can work different angles and leverage to get this ground marked. And if we get this ground marked, I think it'll have a ripple effect, and people will be able to take the precedent of Bessborough and apply it to Sean Ross, apply it to Castle Pollard, places like that. Basically, they'll say, if you let them have it in Cork, why can't you let us have it up here? You know. So.
We're coming so close to the end now of time. Callum, very quickly, if you would. I mean, your film has to be part of that, doesn't it? Simply in telling those stories.
Well, I mean, I hope it was a contribution. One thing I would say actually is that people who've just seen the one today, which unfortunately also because of the nature of the way we're doing this was rather jerky and difficult to follow. Both the films are available. If you Google People and Power, which was the Al Jazeera series it was part of, if you Google People and Power and Ireland's Mother and Baby Homes, you will find both of the films and you'll be able to watch them. And I really would encourage people to watch them. And yeah,
absolutely, they are very worth watching in peace and quiet, and seeing both of them, because they're so important in terms of telling the story. And I just want to end with you. I mean, Maureen is full of hope on your behalf, and there won't be anyone listening to this today that doesn't hope with all their heart that you get a marked burial ground for Evelyn. Are you hopeful?
I am. Without Maureen and Catherine, Dave brings my hopes up, and I feel strong with them by my side. You know, they're brilliant people.
Well, you're such
a
powerful speaker yourself for this, and I mean, incredible.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah. Guys, can I just say for a second, Anne is our inspiration. You know, if I have an empty, an unemptying bucket of hope, it's because Anne survived the things she survived, so I can do this. You know, I think we all need a bit of perspective. If Anne survived the things she survived, we can do anything.
Well, I can honestly say it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you, Anne, today. It really has. I'd like to thank you, especially Anne, for sharing your story. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you for persevering with the technical difficulties. Callum, thanks to absolutely everybody who has watched the film with us today and listened to the fantastic panel. The club, Frontline Club, thank you very much for hosting. The club remains open online with events like this every week during what we hope will be the last days of these difficult restrictions. We look forward to seeing it reopen soon. We look forward to all of us being able to be close to friends and family. It would be lovely to see you and to give you a hug. It's been an absolute privilege to hear from you this evening, and I wish all the best with this. And that's all we have time for, I'm afraid, as we say in television. Thank you so much to everybody. It's been
Thank you.
And thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie.
Take care.